What is up, people? Dunna here, and today, by popular demand, we're going to be comparing 3 variable neutral density filters, or variable NDs. We've got the brand new Moment variable NDs that they claim to be the perfect balance between price and quality. We've got the Freewell NDs with their very cool use of magnets. And then of course, we've got the ever popular PolarPro Peter McKinnon Variable NDs with their coveted fused quartz glass that's supposed to be a cut above the rest. So today, let's see which of these variable NDs reigns supreme. We could just compare them as well. In preparation for this video, I reached out to you guys on social media and asked what you wanted to know about these NDs, and a couple of things stood out. We're gonna talk about price, we're gonna talk about the entire package that you get, because some of these are more than just the ND itself. We're gonna be talking about the user experience and quality, including the accuracy of the stop markings on the filter. And of course, we're gonna talk about the image quality of these filters, including vignetting, color cast, sharpness, the dreaded X pattern, and more. And in case you're interested, I left a link in the description where you can go download the folder full of all the raw files that I shot during the tests for image quality of these filters. So you can go check that out and pixel peep as much as you want without the YouTube compression and stuff that you're gonna see obviously in this video. Also in the description are timestamps, so if you wanna hop around to different parts of the video, you can do that there. And if you have absolutely no idea what an ND filter is or a variable ND, check out this video up here and then come back and watch this afterwards. The reason that I chose these 3 specific brands to compare is because they've kind of done the same thing with their variable NDs. All of them have 2 variable NDs that are split instead of having one with a wider range. So all 3 of these brands have a 2 to 5 stop filter and a 6 to 9 stop filter, which makes it nice to compare. The reason they do this is to try and keep the quality higher. If you have a longer range on your ND, there's more likelihood that you're going to run into problems like more vignetting or the dreaded X pattern that you get when you turn too far. So in total, we've got 6 variable NDs here to compare. All right, let's kick things off by talking about the prices, because that's going to be a huge factor for a lot of people buying a variable ND filter. The Peter McKinnon PolarPro variable NDs are the most expensive of the bunch, coming in at $249 for the 2 to 5 stop, $299 for the 6 to 9 stop, and if you want the pack of both of them, you're looking at $449. Next, on the way down the price list, we've got the Moment variable NDs. The 82mm thread come in at $169 each. Both the 2 to 5 and 6 to 9 are the same price, but if you get the smaller sizes, they actually become less. So I think the 77mm, which are the ones I have here, are $159, and so on and so forth. And if you want to get both of them in a pack, you're looking at $319.99. And finally, the least expensive of the bunch are the Freewell filters, coming in at $109 each, or $199 for the pack of 2. And that doesn't matter what size or which filter you're getting. Also, just so it's pointed out, the PolarPro and Moment come in 67, 77, and 82mm, whereas the Freewell come in 67, 72, 77, or 82mm. So there's one more size to choose from on the Freewells. So we've got a pretty wide range of prices, everything from $109 all the way up to $300 for a single filter. And that's gonna have a lot of people questioning, is it worth it to pay more for your filters? And while image quality is probably the most important thing, there are also other factors to include. For example, we've got all the extras that might come in the package, build quality, user experience, and all of those kinds of things. So let's take a look at what's going on with all of these filters. Let's kick things off with the PolarPro. So if you're a packaging nut, they went all out on this. You can see you got Peter on the back, got a nice write-up, beautiful, beautiful packaging. I know a lot of people are probably thinking, well, that doesn't matter. What difference does it make? But yeah, for some people it does. You got this like topographical map thing going on, nice magnet. You got a beautiful photo on the inside. I believe that's here in Alberta. So the Peter McKinnon filter come in this awesome hard case, nice snap to it with the magnets to close it. Then inside there, you can see there is a lens cap, and this is a really cool lens cap. They're really handy not only to protect, because that's hard, and then there's rubber around the outside, but also to like put on and take off the filters from your camera. And then inside there, we've got our 6 to 9 stop filter. And then if we take this out, we got a little thing from PolarPro with a bunch of information in there. And then on top of the hard case, you also have a soft case. So if you prefer to carry them that way, you can. And inside the soft case, there is a built-in cloth, as well as a custom microfiber cloth with a Peter McKinnon photo on it. So obviously what PolarPro is going for here is really giving you like the premium package. You're not just paying for the filter, and that's probably part of why the filter is more expensive than the other brands. Now moving on to the Freewells. Unfortunately, I don't have any of the original packaging, but it comes in a nice white box. It's really nice and simple. There is a microfiber cloth in there and information as well. They come in these really nice hard cases, again, with a nice snapping magnet. If you saw my other video on the Freewell system, they're all about magnets. Unfortunately, this one doesn't snap on to their magnetic system like a lot of their other filters do, because you need to be able to turn the actual variable ND itself. But it does have the magnet for the lens cap itself, which is really cool in my opinion. Absolutely love these lens caps because they don't take up any extra space. It's such a little thin piece of metal and it just snaps onto the front. And then moving on to the moment filters. They come in these really interesting cases that look like film canisters. And when you unscrew, there's a circular microfiber cloth, which is really cool. And then the filter itself. And that's it. Personally, I would not want to use these as cases, and I would probably throw these in some kind of a case that would then go in my bag that could hold a whole bunch of filters. Mostly because this is just like, it's not a pleasant sound or feeling. As much as it looks very cool, it's very, like, aesthetically, it's very, very cool. But the experience of like dealing with them is not my favorite. No lens caps or anything for these ones. Nothing extra, just mostly the filters and those microfiber cloths. Okay, so talking about the build of these, the PolarPro and the Freewell have very similar kind of weights to them. The Moment feel a little bit lighter. And one thing that I noticed right away about the Moment that I didn't like so much is that the front part is so much wider than the other filters. I can actually fit the PolarPro ones inside of those Moment filters, or the Freewell ones for that matter. I'm not sure why they decided to do that, but they've made the outside, the front kind of filter of it so much wider. So if you're someone who wants to leave the filter on and put it in your bag, you're gonna have to deal with that. And that's actually something that I really like about the Freewells, is that their magnetic lens cap doesn't take up any extra space. So if you're trying to throw it in your bag with the filter on, you can toss that lens cap on and it's not gonna be harder to fit in because it's wider. The PolarPros do have that problem because their lens cap actually takes up a little bit extra space because of how bulky it is. And then the Moment, because you can't actually get a lens cap on these as far as I'm aware at all, you're gonna wanna take these off before you toss them in your bag. Unless you're someone who doesn't care about that kind of thing, and then toss them in your bag all you want. All 6 of these filters feel like they have a solid metal construction. They all feel nice and smooth when you're moving them. I did notice that the PolarPro ones are a lot easier to move, and then the Freewells are the hardest to move, so they're pretty stiff, which sometimes can be a little bit tough if you're running and gunning and you need to change settings quickly, but it's not going to accidentally move out of its position, so that can be seen as both a pro and a con. All 6 of these filters have hard stops on them, which means that you can't keep spinning them, and they have markers on them to let you know how many stops of light you are reducing. On the PolarPro, we've got stop markers, so it says like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. On the Freewells, it's the same, and there's just a little arrow pointing to it. On the Moment filters, they actually did it with the ND markers. So it's got ND4, ND8, ND16, and ND32, and that's your 2 to 5 stop. And then we've got ND64, 128, 256, and 512, and that's your 6 to 9 stop. And I really like the Moment system. There's a little notch cut out where you can see the dot of the stop that you're on. And that made it really easy to make sure that I was getting a nice, accurate reading when I was doing my tests. And lastly, they're all about the same thickness. I think maybe the Freewells are just a little bit thinner than the other two, but it's really, really close. Okay, now for the moment you've been waiting for, let's talk about image quality. I tried to be as thorough as I possibly could with the testing of these filters and answer all the questions that you guys gave me. So I even set up my own little testing situation. So let's hop over there and I'll show you what I did. Okay, so first of all, as you can see, I set up a little bit of a test room here. I've put my two big audio blankets that block out all the light so that I could have a controlled situation, or as controlled as I could possibly get it, so that as I was going through testing the camera with no filter on it and then with all the different filters on it, I could make sure that I was getting an identical shot. I've got my A7 III set up with the Tamron 17-28. I thought it was important to use this lens because I wanted to see how much vignetting we would see on a super wide lens. Then I've got the X-Rite color checker video here taped up on a little light stand, and that just is going to be where we're going to focus. And then I've got the Aperture 120D up here giving a nice soft light across the whole situation. Now the first shot that I got was a control shot, so one without any filter on, and I actually took two. I took one at 17mm and one at 28mm, so that we could see how the vignetting was at each focal length. I set the camera to ISO 100, f4 so that we would have enough depth of field so that the whole color checker should be technically in focus, and then I used my shutter speed to dial in my exposure. In order to dial in exposure, I set my zebras to 50 IRE, and then I used my shutter speed to make sure that I saw some zebras on the middle gray portion of the color checker. Then I took a shot without the filter on at 17mm and 28mm, both focusing into the center point of the color checker, and that's where I focus for all of the test shots. Once I'm done that, without moving anything, I grab a filter, I slap it on there. I took a shot at the minimum of every filter and at every stop on the filter. And to dial in my exposure properly, I would use that same procedure with the 50 IRE on the middle gray, so that ideally we would have the same exposure on all the shots. I also used a 2-second timer to make sure that I wasn't shaking the camera so that we would get optimal sharpness. Now the reason that I took so many photos is because I wanted to see what the vignetting was like throughout the range, as well as I wanted to see how accurate the markings on each filter are. That was something that I got a question about on Instagram. So let's talk about that for a second, starting off with the PolarPro Peter McKinnon Variable NDs. The PolarPros were pretty accurate throughout. I found that they were about 1/3 of a stop dark all the way through. At the very minimum, which is below 2 stops, it's actually 1 2/3 of a stop. Then when you go up to where it says 2 stops, it's actually about 2 1/3. Maybe just a little bit less than 2 1/3. Same thing, 3 is 3 1/3, 4 is 4 1/3, and 5 is 5 1/3. Now this is like, they're just over what they're saying, and it went through the 6 to 9 as well like that. So it's just a little bit darker than what it says, but very, very close to being accurate and very consistent throughout. The Freewell was actually the other way. So when it says 2 stops, it's actually about 1 2/3 of a stop. 3 stops is 2 2/3, and so on and so forth. It's about 1/3 of a stop lighter than what it promises. And then on the 6 to 9 filter, it's actually 2/3 of a stop lighter than it's supposed to be. So you're actually getting a 5 1/3 stop to 8 1/3 stop, not all the way 6 to 9. But it is consistent throughout the range. And the moment filters were a little bit further out than the other two. The moment filters don't actually go below 2 stops, and at the 2 stop mark, it was actually about 2/3 of a stop too dark. And then throughout the rest of the range, it was only about 1/3 of a stop dark. Then the 6 to 9 filter actually starts at 7 stops and goes to about 9 2/3 of a stop. So it's significantly darker than it's supposed to be. So again, the most consistent throughout was the PolarPro. It's not exactly what it promises, but within a margin of error of like my testing not being perfect and stuff, I'd say it's pretty darn good. And then the Freewell did a pretty good job, a little bit less consistent than the PolarPro, but still really good. And then the moment filters again were a little bit further out. One of the biggest questions that I got was if there is a color cast on all of of these different filters. All of these companies claim that they have minimal color casting, but there is an inherent amount of color cast to all of them. So let's talk about that. Starting again with the PolarPro 2 to 5 filter, there is a pretty serious yellow color shift. And as you push from the 2 to the 5 stops, you'll see even a little bit of blue going in there, and we're gonna talk about that a little bit later. The PolarPro 6 to 9 filter is the cleanest as far as color goes, with very, very minimal color shifting. The 2 to 5 Freewell filter had a very similar yellow color shift to the PolarPro, but the 6 to 9 actually pushed a little bit more green than yellow. And then the moment filters actually went the opposite way of the Freewells. The 2 to 5 stop actually looked a little bit more green, and the 6 to 9 looked a little bit more yellow. So the PolarPro comes out on top in this category as well. Even though the 2 to 5 had that yellow color shift, the 6 to 9 was the only one of the bunch that had a fairly clean color. Definitely the closest to the control shots. Another topic that you guys wanted me to cover really bad was the vignetting of these filters. And I mentioned earlier that on the PolarPro 2 to 5, there was some weird blue shifting that happened at the higher end of that filter, and that comes from the vignetting. Just pausing here for a quick clarification. In this section of the video, I keep referring to vignetting when what we're actually looking at is cross polarization. I'm not sure why I had the word vignetting stuck in my head while I was recording this section. They do have a similar effect in that they both darken around the edges of the image, but technically they aren't the same thing. So again, this section we are talking about cross polarization. The reason that they split these filters into 2 to 5 and 6 to 9 stops is to stop too much vignetting. Because of the hard stops, you can stop it before that happens. But the 2 to 5, especially when you're super wide, like I was at 17 millimeters, is really, really rough. And you can see these crazy blue corners coming in. Even at about 4 stops, you start to see them. It's pretty clean when you're down at about 2 stops, but it gets pretty bad when you're up at the higher end. And the PolarPro 6 to 9, there's still kind of a creeping vignette throughout, but it's not nearly as bad as the 2 to 5 stop is. Also, when I zoom in to 28 millimeters, the vignetting and stuff is definitely less of a problem, which is basically what you would expect since you're not as wide. I was very impressed with the Freewell performance on this. The 2 to 5 had barely any vignetting at all and didn't have that weird color shift that we saw in the PolarPro. And then the 6 to 9 filter had a little bit of that creeping vignetting that we saw on the 6 to 9 from PolarPro as well, but again, without the color shift in the corners. And then the moment filters actually kind of did something weird. The 2 to 5 stop was actually the worst at 2 stops and got better throughout the range up to 5, which I wasn't expecting at all. And then the 6 to 9 filter, it felt like we had some pretty heavy vignetting kind of throughout the range. It didn't seem to get worse as I went further into the range, but it was just kind of there the whole time. Now, just so it's said, I am using all of these filters with a step-up ring. I'm using a Freewell step-up ring actually right now because it was the thinnest one I had, so it should be affecting the vignetting as little as possible. And the final and probably most requested point as far as quality goes is the sharpness. A lot of people worry that when they put a filter on their lens, they're going to be reducing the sharpness, and that's pretty much inevitable. As you put more and more pieces of glass in front of your camera, you're going to be filtering out some of that clarity. That being said, the PolarPro filters do a fantastic job. The 6 to 9 especially is super, super sharp. Going from the control shot with no filter on whatsoever and flipping over into the PolarPro ones, it is really hard to see a difference. If you zoom in like 3 to 1, you might be able to notice, but man, you're splitting hairs at this point. And speaking of splitting hairs, the Freewell and Moment also performed really well, but the PolarPro was definitely the sharpest, with the Freewell coming in just behind it, just a little bit. And then the Moment filters, if you zoom in really far and you're really pixel peeping, you can tell that they are a little bit less sharp than the other two. But again, like they're all performing really well in this category. So I'm definitely really impressed with all the sharpness that's coming out of all of these filters. Okay, so you've seen the image quality, you've heard everything there is to know about these filters. Now you're probably asking the question, which one of these do I get? Here are my thoughts. The PolarPro probably is worth the most. It's got great image quality and the most that comes in the package, but everyone's asking the question, is it worth that much more? It's significantly more expensive than the Moment and even more expensive than the Freewell. And like I said, in the image tests, it doesn't outperform them by that much. So this is really gonna be something that you're gonna have to ask yourself, are all those little extras that you get in the package and that little bump in image quality, is that going to be worth it for you to go for the PolarPros? And then we've got the Moment, which seemed like a direct call out to the Peter McKinnon PolarPro filters. When they came out, they were talking about how they found this balance between quality and price, because when the PolarPro came out, people were talking about the price of them a lot. But then you factor in the Freewells, and all of a sudden the Moment kind of, I don't know where to put them anymore, because if you want the budget option, you've got the Freewells, and if you want the super expensive, more in the package, all of that kind of stuff, you've got the PolarPros. And the Freewells actually outperformed the Moment, in my opinion, and they come with that magnetic lens cap, which I think is fairly valuable, whereas these don't come with any kind of extras. Now, again, it's not that the Moment filters are bad, it's just that with the other options available, it's hard for me to suggest these to anyone when I've got these two options. Talking about the Freewells for a second, these are really the ones that I think win the competition for me. You can get the set of 2 to 5 and 6 to 9 from Freewell for less than the price of one of the PolarPro Peter McKinnon filters. That's crazy value what you're getting. And as we saw in the image quality tests, these actually outperform the Peter McKinnon filters in some of the different categories. Also, again, I have to say how much I love that magnetic lens cap. And most of the time when people ask me for my opinion, they're looking for budget options, and this just really hits it. Bang for buck, these are definitely the best option out of what I have on the table here. Now, that being said, like I said, if you are the all-out person and you need all of the extras, and maybe you're a big Peter McKinnon fan, then it's a no-brainer to go with these guys. But if you want great bang for buck and you're budget conscious, definitely go with the Freewells. I'm really happy with them, and I'm definitely going to be suggesting them to people in the future. But as always, I'm going to leave all the links for all of these filters in the description, as well as all my other gear, so you can go check that out for yourself. As I mentioned before, there's also a link down there that you can go download all the raw files, so you can check that out for yourself and do your own comparisons. And as always, I want to hear what you think. Which one is your favorite? Which one would you pick up if you were looking for a new variable ND? Leave a comment below, and on your way down there, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Make sure to hit that bell notification so you get notified when I post new videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.